Jake always thought the faint smell of vanilla and cheap coffee lingering in Alexandra's hair was just the stubborn scent of her late shifts at the diner. He never questioned why her grease-stained apron was perfectly folded at the bottom of her tote bag instead of tossed in the laundry, or why her phone screen blinked face down on the nightstand at 3 in the morning. But the crumpled neon pink receipt from a highway motel, wedged deep beneath the passenger seat of their rusting Honda, whispered of a life she was living entirely in the shadows. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet, dangerous spaces where trust fractures and secrets bleed into the light, stay here and walk this path with me. Dawn in Scranton always felt more like an apology than a new beginning. The sky outside the frosted apartment window was a bruised, heavy purple, the color of exhausted muscle. Jake Montgomery sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, the springs groaning softly in protest beneath his weight. His steel-toed boots, scuffed white at the edges from kicking wooden pallets at the regional distribution warehouse, felt like lead anchors. He had just finished a 12-hour overnight shift, his lower back humming with a dull, familiar ache that no amount of cheap ibuprofen could touch. Beside him, Alexandra was deeply asleep. The rhythmic rise and fall of the thin floral duvet was the only sound in the cramped room, save for the pathetic rattle of the ancient refrigerator in the kitchen. She looked impossibly small, curled up on her side, her dark hair spilling across the pillow. She was supposed to be tired. She had told him she picked up a double shift at Lou's, the 24-hour diner down by the interstate, where she poured coffee for weary truckers and insomniacs. Jake reached over, carefully picking up her canvas tote bag from the floor to move it out of the walkway. As he lifted it, the bag tipped. A cheap plastic compact clattered onto the scuffed linoleum, followed by a shower of loose change, a tube of cherry lip balm, and her work apron. Jake frowned. He knelt, his knees popping in the quiet room, and reached for the apron. It was neatly folded into a perfect tight square. There was no smell of stale grease, no faint waft of burned onions or harsh industrial bleach. It smelled faintly of lavender detergent. It hadn't been worn. His rough, calloused fingers paused. A cold, metallic sensation began to pool in his stomach. He reached further into the spilled contents of the bag to gather the coins. Tucked inside the folds of an old gum wrapper was a crumpled piece of paper, not a diner receipt. The paper was an obnoxious, neon pink. Jake unfolded it slowly, the crinkling sound deafening in the silence. The Starlight Motel, Route 81, Room 114, paid in cash. Check-in, 11:30 p.m. Check-out, 3:15 a.m. The times perfectly overlapped with the middle of her supposed double shift. Jake didn't gasp. He didn't drop the paper. He simply knelt there on the cold floor, the neon pink slip burning against the dirt embedded in his fingerprints. He looked up at Alexandra. The soft morning light caught the curve of her cheek, illuminating the faint trace of expensive, musky cologne lingering on her neck. A scent that certainly didn't belong to him, and definitely didn't belong to the fry cook at Lou's. He thought about the past 3 months. The way she had stopped complaining about the water bill, the way her phone was always face down, silenced, glowing with phantom notifications in the dead of night. The new, subtle shimmer of a silver bracelet she claimed she bought at a thrift store, though the clasp caught the light like something straight out of a jeweler's display. A sudden, violent urge to wake her, to shake her until she told him the truth, surged up his throat like bile. He wanted to hear the excuses, to watch her eyes widen in panic, to shatter the quiet morning with the ugly reality of what she had done. But Jake was a man who spent his life stacking heavy boxes in silence, enduring the weight, because complaining changed nothing. He looked at the receipt again, memorizing the room number, the timestamp, the precise geometry of his own heartbreak. Then, with agonizing slowness, he folded the pink paper back into its exact creases. He tucked it inside the gum wrapper, placed it back into the canvas tote, and set the neatly folded, unworn apron right on top. He didn't say a word. The real punishment, Jake realized as he silently unlaced his heavy boots, wouldn't be in the screaming. It would be in the watching. The heater in Jake's 1998 Honda Accord had stopped working 3 winters ago, leaving the cabin perpetually smelling of damp upholstery and stale frost. On a normal Tuesday morning, after a 12-hour shift moving pallets of frozen goods, he would have taken the State Street exit, driving straight toward the cramped, one-bedroom apartment that consumed more than half his paycheck. Today, his hands, calloused and stiff from the cold, steered the wheel past the exit, merging onto the desolate stretch of Route 81. The Starlight Motel was not a place designed for lingering. It sat tucked behind a rusted guardrail and a dying grove of pines, a relic of the highway's busier days. Its neon sign buzzed with a frantic, dying energy. The A&I burnt out completely. Jake parked near a row of overflowing dumpsters at the edge of the lot, cutting the engine. The sudden silence in the car was deafening, save for the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the cooling engine block. He didn't have to wait long. At 7:15 a.m., exactly 15 minutes before Alexandra was supposed to text him that her double shift at Lou's Diner had ended, the heavy, dark green door of room 114 clicked open. Jake held his breath. His fingers dug into the peeling vinyl of the steering wheel. A man stepped out first. Jake recognized him instantly. Marcus. He was the regional supplier for the diner, the man who brought in the frozen fries and bulk coffee syrup. Jake had seen him a handful of times, usually leaning against the stainless steel counter at Lou's, wearing crisp, brand-name polo shirts that never seemed to wrinkle, smelling of sandalwood, and leaving $20 tips for $5 breakfasts. Now Marcus was casually shrugging on a tailored wool coat, adjusting his collar against the morning chill. He looked comfortable, untouched by the grind of the city. Then, Alexandra emerged. She did not look like a woman who had spent the last 16 hours carrying heavy trays of meatloaf or scraping burnt eggs off cast-iron skillets. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves across her shoulders, not pulled back into the tight, functional bun she always wore to work. She was wearing a beige trench coat Jake had never seen before, and as she stepped into the pale morning light, she laughed. It was a quiet, effortless sound. She reached out, her hand resting casually on the small of Marcus's back as they walked toward a gleaming, silver sedan parked 3 spaces down. The casual intimacy of the gesture struck Jake harder than a closed fist. It wasn't a desperate, hidden affair of stolen kisses in dark alleys. It was a comfortable, established routine. They moved like a couple who had nothing to hide, at least not from each other. Jake watched as Marcus opened the passenger door for her. Alexandra slid into the leather seat, offering him a soft, lingering smile before the heavy door thumped shut, sealing her inside a world of heated seats and imported coffee. In the driver's seat of his freezing, rattling Honda, Jake felt an icy hollow carve itself out in his chest. The exhaustion that usually weighed down his bones was gone, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline clarity. Every time she had kissed his cheek and complained about her aching feet, every time they had sat at their chipped kitchen table, calculating which bills to delay so they could buy groceries, it had all been a performance. She was not drowning with him, she had found a lifeboat, and she was simply letting him sink alone. Marcus started the sedan, its engine a smooth, expensive purr that barely carried across the asphalt. As the silver car pulled out of the lot and disappeared onto the highway, heading back toward the city to resume the illusion of their separate lives, Jake did not start his own car. He sat in the cold, staring at the empty parking space in front of room 114, letting the reality of his shattered marriage settle deep into his marrow. The radiator in the corner of the living room hissed, a steady, metallic rattling that usually drove Jake insane. Tonight, as he sat at the chipped Formica kitchen table, he welcomed the noise. It filled the suffocating silence of the apartment, masking the heavy, erratic thud of his own heartbeat. Spread out before him was the familiar deck of their shared anxieties, the electric bill with its red final notice stamp, the minimum payment for the credit card, and the rent check he still needed to sign. At 4:15 p.m., the deadbolt clicked. Alexandra pushed through the door, letting her heavy canvas tote bag slide off her shoulder and hit the scuffed linoleum with a dull thud. She kicked off her sensible, black non-slip shoes, letting out a long, theatrical sigh that Jake had heard 1,000 times before. "I swear, if Lou schedules me for one more back-to-back shift, I'm going to throw a coffee pot through the front window," she announced, massaging the back of her neck. Jake looked up from the bills. He studied her face under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light of the kitchen. Her skin was flushed, and her hair was back in its tight, functional bun, exactly as it should be. The beige trench coat from the morning was nowhere to be seen, likely hidden deep within the trunk of her car or stashed in a locker at the diner. She had reconstructed the illusion perfectly. "Rough day?" Jake asked. His voice sounded surprisingly steady, though it felt like swallowing glass to push the words out. "You have no idea." Alexandra walked over, leaning down to press a kiss to his cheek. Jake didn't flinch, but his muscles locked tight. He caught the faint, lingering trace of the lavender detergent on her apron, but beneath it, so subtle he wouldn't have noticed if he wasn't hunting for it, was the sharp, clean scent of Motel soap. It was the smell of a quick, desperate shower taken before returning to the grinding reality of Scranton. Table 4 left a handful of pennies on a $40 check, and the new fry cook burned 2 batches of hash browns, she continued, moving to the refrigerator to pull out a pitcher of filtered water. "I'm just glad to be home. I missed you." She poured a glass, her back turned to him. Jake watched the line of her spine, the familiar curve of her shoulders. She was lying with breathtaking ease. The exhaustion she wore like a badge of honor was not from pouring coffee or dealing with rude truckers. It was the fatigue of living 2 lives, of calculating timelines and scrubbing away the evidence of Marcus's expensive cologne. "I made mac and cheese," Jake said quietly, gesturing to the stovetop where a tin pot sat cooling. "Added the hot dogs, just how you like it." Alexandra turned around, offering him a warm, appreciative smile that made Jake's stomach twist. "You're the best, Jake. Truly, I don't know how I'd get through this week without you." She brought her bowl to the table, sitting across from him. As she ate, she talked. She filled the tiny kitchen with stories of the diner, of the obnoxious regulars, and the broken milkshake machine. She seamlessly wove a tapestry of blue-collar struggle, anchoring herself to their shared poverty, while holding on to a secret that tasted of silver sedans and crisp $50 bills. Jake simply nodded, chewing his food methodically. He didn't ask questions that would trip her up. He didn't demand to know where the extra tip money she claimed to have made was going. Instead, he observed. He watched the way her eyes darted to her phone every time the screen lit up with a spam email. He noted the way she kept her left hand, the one that used to absent-mindedly trace the rim of her coffee cup, tucked safely in her lap. The apartment felt different now. The peeling wallpaper, the drafty windows, the stack of unpaid bills. None of it was a testament to their mutual survival anymore. It was a cage, and Jake was the only one who realized the door had already been left wide open. The poison had taken root, and as he offered his wife a tired, supportive smile, he knew the silence would be far more devastating than any screaming match could ever be. The plumbing in the apartment always rattled when the shower was running, a harsh, metallic coughing that vibrated through the thin walls. While Alexandra stood beneath the lukewarm spray, washing away the remnants of another fabricated double shift, Jake stood in their dimly lit bedroom, conducting an inventory of his own. He didn't tear the room apart. There was no frantic tossing of drawers or desperate searching beneath the mattress. Jake's method was far more surgical. He moved with the quiet, deliberate precision of a man who packed fragile goods into freight trucks for a living. He started with the canvas tote bag she left slumped against the radiator. Inside, beneath the crumpled apron and the loose change, he found her bi-weekly pay stub from Lou's Diner. It was crumpled, folded over twice, as if meant to be thrown away, but she had forgotten it. Jake smoothed the thin paper out on the edge of the dresser. He read the black ink illuminated by the street lamp filtering through the blinds. Hours worked, 36. Alexandra had claimed 60 hours over the past 2 weeks. She had complained every night about her aching arches, the grease burns on her forearms, and the relentless demands of the late-night diner crowd. She had brought home crisp, unwrinkled $50 bills, dropping them into the cracked ceramic jar in the kitchen with a tired, proud smile, calling it exceptional tip money from the truckers. Jake looked at the pay stub, his jaw tightening. The extra cash wasn't from sympathetic truck drivers. It was Marcus's money. It was guilt money, or worse, an allowance for her time. Jake pulled his cracked smartphone from his pocket, opened the camera, and snapped a clear, steady photo of the document. He created a hidden folder on his phone, burying it deep within the settings where she would never think to look. He moved next to the closet. Tucked far in the back, behind her heavy winter coats, hung the beige trench coat he had seen her wearing at the Starlight Motel. He reached into the pockets. His rough fingers brushed against a thick, textured piece of paper. He pulled it out. A receipt from an upscale steakhouse in downtown Scranton, a place where a single glass of wine cost more than their weekly grocery budget. Table 4. 2 guests. Paid with Visa, ending in 4102. Jake didn't own a Visa. He photographed the receipt, sliding the digital image into the hidden folder. It was not enough to know she was cheating. Jake understood the fragile ecosystem of their blue-collar neighborhood. If he simply accused her, Alexandra would cry, play the victim, and blame their poverty or his emotional distance. She would spin a narrative of a neglected wife seeking comfort. To truly expose her, to make the community see the absolute ugliness of her choices, he needed an irrefutable timeline, a ledger of deceit. The water in the bathroom shut off with a loud, final thump in the pipes. Jake immediately returned the receipt to the pocket of the trench coat, folded the pay stub exactly as he had found it, and dropped it back into her tote bag. He moved to the edge of the bed, picking up a frayed paperback novel he had been pretending to read for weeks. The bathroom door creaked open. Alexandra emerged in a cloud of damp steam, wrapped in a faded white towel. She rubbed her temples, letting out a long, exhausted breath. "I think the hot water heater is dying again," she murmured, walking over to her vanity mirror. "And my legs are killing me. Lou kept me on my feet for 9 straight hours today without a break." Jake turned a page of his book, not looking up. His heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm, a cold drum in his chest. "You work too hard, Alex," Jake said, his voice flat, perfectly capturing the tone of a sympathetic, defeated husband. "Maybe you should ask for fewer shifts next week." Alexandra paused, her hand hovering over a bottle of cheap lotion. She looked at him through the reflection in the mirror, a flicker of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps calculation, crossing her features before she settled into a soft, martyrdom smile. "You know we can't afford that, Jake. We have to do what we have to do." Jake looked up, meeting her gaze in the glass. "Yeah," he replied softly, "we do." The silence in the Montgomery apartment had undergone a subtle, tectonic shift. For years, the quiet between Jake and Alexandra had been a shared, exhausted thing, the heavy stillness of two people too tired, from working blue-collar jobs, to fill the air with useless chatter. But over the last 2 weeks, Jake's silence had become something else entirely. It was hollow, eerily serene. Alexandra stood at the cramped kitchen counter, stirring a packet of artificial sweetener into her lukewarm coffee. She watched Jake through the doorway as he laced up his steel-toed boots in the living hall. He didn't sigh. He didn't rub his lower back or complain about the impending 12-hour shift at the warehouse. He simply tied the heavy laces with methodical precision, his face a calm, unreadable mask. "He's completely checked out," Alexandra thought, a sudden, self-serving pang of pity fluttering in her chest. She convinced herself that the relentless grind of Scranton, the past due notices, the failing transmission on the Honda, the inescapable poverty, had finally broken his spirit. He wasn't pulling away from her, she reasoned. He was pulling away from life. It was a convenient narrative. Framing her marriage as a tragically sinking ship made it infinitely easier to justify climbing into a lifeboat. "I'll probably be late tomorrow," Alexandra said, leaning against the doorframe. "Lou asked me to cover the dinner rush." Jake paused at the door, his hand resting on the cheap brass knob. He turned his head, his eyes meeting hers under the dim hallway bulb. There was no suspicion in his gaze, no jealousy or frustration, just that same, chilling emptiness. "Okay," he said softly. "Drive safe, Alex. Make sure you get some rest when you can." He closed the door behind him with a quiet click. Alexandra let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The guilt that usually gnawed at the edges of her conscience was briefly washed away by a wave of intense, suffocating loneliness. She left the half-drunk coffee on the counter, grabbed her canvas tote, and headed for the diner. 3 hours later, the afternoon lull settled over Lou's diner. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the sticky vinyl booths and the salt shakers crusted with humidity. Alexandra slipped out the back door into the biting Pennsylvania air, shivering as the cold bit through her thin cardigan. Marcus's silver sedan was idling by the dumpsters, a beacon of warmth and imported leather. She opened the passenger door and slid inside, immediately enveloped by the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and expensive climate control. "You look tired, beautiful," Marcus murmured, reaching over to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His hands were soft, the nails perfectly manicured, hands that had never touched a wooden pallet or scrubbed a grease trap. Alexandra leaned into his touch, closing her eyes against the bleak backdrop of the alleyway. "He's like a ghost lately," she confessed, her voice thick with genuine emotion. albeit misdirected. It's like living with a shadow. We don't even fight anymore about the bills. He just stares right through me. Marcus clicked his tongue in quiet sympathy, his thumb tracing her jawline. Some men just can't handle the pressure, he said smoothly, a patronizing edge to his tone that Alexandra was too desperate to notice. You deserve someone who sees you, someone who can actually take care of you. He reached into the center console and produced a small velvet box, dropping it lightly into her lap. Inside was a delicate white gold necklace. It was elegant, understated, and cost more than Jake made in a month of overnight shifts. Alexandra traced the cold metal with trembling fingers. In the safety of the heated sedan, insulated from the grime of the diner and the suffocating silence of her apartment, she made a choice. She allowed herself to fully believe the lie. She believed that Marcus was her future, and that Jake was merely a tragic, unavoidable casualty of her pursuit of happiness. She leaned across the console and kissed him, entirely unaware of the invisible snare tightening around her ankle, preparing to drag her back down to the concrete. Saturday morning brought the heavy, oppressive humidity typical of late July in Pennsylvania. Today was the annual Lou's Diner staff potluck at Naog Park, a mandatory display of blue-collar camaraderie. For years, Jake had dreaded the event. The warm, cheap beer, the endless complaints about the restaurant industry, and the suffocating closeness of a community that knew exactly how much everyone else earned. Today, however, he moved with a dark, inevitable purpose. While Alexandra was at the grocery store buying mayonnaise and celery for her contribution to the potluck, Jake sat alone at the kitchen table. In front of him lay 3 glossy 4x6 photographs he had printed at an automated kiosk in a pharmacy 3 towns over. He hadn't used the local drugstore. In a neighborhood this small, a clerk could easily recognize him and start asking questions. He stared at the prints. The neon-pink Starlight Motel receipt. The exorbitant steakhouse bill paid with a Visa ending in 4102. The third was new, a crisp, high-resolution shot of the white gold necklace resting inside its velvet box, which he had found hastily shoved into the toe of her winter boot the night before. Jake didn't feel the sharp sting of betrayal anymore when he looked at the glossy paper. The raw emotions of the past few weeks had calcified into something cold, hard, and strictly functional. He reached across the table and picked up Alexandra's faded floral recipe binder. It was a chaotic collection of magazine clippings and handwritten index cards. Every year at the barbecue, Brenda, the loud, perpetually gossiping day shift manager at Lou's, inevitably asked to borrow the binder to copy down Alexandra's famous potato salad recipe. It was a neighborhood tradition, as predictable as the sun rising. Jake opened the binder, the metal rings snapping loudly in the quiet apartment. He flipped past the casseroles and the cheap desserts, stopping at the grease-stained page for the potato salad. With steady hands, he took the photograph of the motel receipt and slipped it into the clear plastic sleeve, sliding it directly behind the recipe card so it would be impossible to miss once the page was turned. He placed the photo of the steakhouse bill behind a recipe for deviled eggs. Finally, he took the picture of the velvet jewelry box and tucked it into the very front pocket of the binder, leaving a fraction of the photo protruding to catch the light. He closed the heavy cover. It looked exactly the same. Harmless. Domestic. When the deadbolt clicked 30 minutes later, Jake was on the couch, watching a muted baseball game. Alexandra bustled in, her arms laden with plastic grocery bags, her forehead damp with sweat. "It's boiling out there," she complained, dropping the bags onto the counter with a heavy sigh. She was wearing a simple, pale yellow sundress, her dark hair tied back with a ribbon. Around her neck, the delicate white gold chain gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. "Necklace looks nice," Jake said smoothly, his eyes remaining fixed on the television screen. "Is that new?" Alexandra froze for a fraction of a second, her hand instinctively flying to her throat to cover the metal. She recovered quickly, forcing a light, casual laugh. "Oh, this? I found it at that thrift store on Elm Street yesterday. $10. Can you believe it? The clasp is a little bent, but I fixed it." "Good find," Jake replied, finally turning his head to look at her. His voice was warm, perfectly modulated, completely devoid of accusation. "You always had an eye for the expensive-looking stuff." Alexandra smiled, visibly relieved that the lie had landed so easily, and turned her attention to boiling the potatoes. She hummed a soft, upbeat tune, completely oblivious to the floral binder sitting mere inches from her elbow. Jake leaned back against the frayed cushions of the couch, listening to the clatter of pots and pans, waiting for the afternoon sun to begin its slow, devastating descent over Naog Park. The late afternoon sun baked the cracked asphalt of Naog Park, radiating a suffocating heat that made the air shimmer above the charcoal grills. The annual Lou's Diner barbecue was a loud, chaotic affair, populated by tired people determined to wring a few hours of joy from their meager weekend. Children chased each other through the heavy, humid air, while the adults congregated under the wooden pavilion, clutching sweating cans of domestic beer and swapping the same exhausted complaints about restaurant management. Jake sat at the edge of the pavilion on a splintering picnic bench, an unopened can of cheap lager resting on his knee. He wore a faded flannel shirt over a white tee, playing his assigned role to absolute perfection, the quiet, reliable, overworked warehouse husband. A few yards away, Alexandra was holding court. The pale yellow sundress she wore seemed to catch the breeze, setting her apart from the grease-stained reality of her co-workers. She laughed at a joke made by one of the line cooks, throwing her head back. The white gold necklace caught the harsh afternoon sunlight, flashing a brilliant, expensive warning. It was a flawless performance of domestic contentment. She looked beautiful. She looked entirely untouchable. Jake's gaze drifted from his wife's throat to the center of the main picnic table. Resting between a massive, dented aluminum tray of baked beans and a stack of flimsy paper plates was the faded floral recipe binder. The trap was sitting in plain sight, a silent bomb ticking down in the stifling summer heat. "Jake, you're looking a million miles away, buddy," a loud voice boomed over the sizzle of the grill. It was Lou, the diner's owner, a heavy-set man with a permanent sheen of sweat on his forehead and ash on his apron. "Alex wearing you out? She's been pulling shifts like a machine lately. Tell her to take a breath, will ya? You guys are gonna kill yourselves trying to get ahead." Jake offered a slow, measured nod, lifting his aluminum can in a mock toast. "We do what we have to do, Lou. You know how it is in this town. Bills don't pay themselves." "Ain't that the goddamn truth?" Lou grunted, turning back to flip a row of charred burgers. Alexandra caught Jake's eye through the crowd and offered him a warm, appreciative smile. She clearly thought his brief interaction with Lou was a testament to their shared struggle, a husband validating her hard work to her boss. She mouthed the words, "I love you," across the distance of the pavilion, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Jake held her gaze. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. He simply acknowledged her with a slight, heavy tilt of his head, letting her believe the illusion was safe. It was a terrifying, hollow realization for him, discovering how easy it was to lie, how remarkably simple it was to mirror the absolute deceit she had mastered over the past few months. Then, the inevitable happened. Brenda, the day shift manager whose voice carried like a foghorn across the diner floor, materialized from the crowd. She wiped her hands on her faded denim shorts and made a beeline for the food table. "All right, Alex," she shouted, her voice cutting sharply through the ambient chatter. "I brought the Tupperware. You promised me that potato salad recipe this year, and I am not leaving this park without it." Alexandra laughed, turning her back to Jake. "It's right there in the binder, Brenda, next to the cooler. Help yourself. Just don't steal my original index cards." Jake's grip on his can tightened, the thin metal buckling slightly under the pressure, the condensation dripping onto his jeans. The ambient noise of the park, the screeching children, the hissing charcoal, the tinny radio playing classic rock, seemed to instantly fade into a dull, rushing hum in his ears. He watched Brenda reach out with a damp hand and pull the heavy floral binder toward her chest. The time for quiet endurance was over. The execution was about to begin. Brenda leaned against the edge of the wooden picnic table, flipping through the heavy, grease-stained pages of the floral binder. She hummed off-key to the classic rock drifting from a nearby portable radio, her damp thumb tracing the laminated tabs. Casseroles. Desserts. Salads. She found the section and opened it flat, fully intending to copy down the exact ratio of mayonnaise to mustard that made Alexandra's potato salad a local staple. Instead of a handwritten index card, the afternoon sun caught the glossy sheen of a 4x6 photograph. Brenda frowned, her thick, penciled eyebrows pulling together. She assumed it was a misplaced family picture, perhaps a snapshot of Jake and Alexandra from a rare vacation. She picked it up. Her eyes scanned the stark white text printed against the neon pink background of the Starlight Motel receipt. The room number, the timestamp, the cash payment in the dead of night. A heavy, confused stillness settled over Brenda. She turned the page, her movements suddenly slow and mechanical. Tucked behind the recipe for deviled eggs was another photograph, an itemized receipt from a downtown steakhouse. The total at the bottom was a number that represented 2 weeks of grueling tips at Lou's Diner. Brenda's breath hitched in her throat. Her gaze darted to the front pocket of the binder, where a third photograph protruded slightly. She pulled it free. It was a high-resolution, perfectly lit image of a delicate white gold necklace resting against dark velvet. Slowly, as if moving underwater, Brenda lifted her head. Across the crowded pavilion, Alexandra was standing near the coolers, laughing brightly at something a line cook had just said. The pale yellow sundress caught the breeze, but Brenda's eyes were locked on the hollow of Alexandra's throat. There, gleaming with an arrogant, undeniable brilliance in the Scranton sun, was the exact same white gold necklace from the photograph. The loud, brassy voice that Brenda used to command the diner floor completely evaporated. She didn't scream. She didn't point. She simply leaned to her right, tapping the shoulder of Maria, a waitress who had worked at Lou's for 15 years. Brenda wordlessly slid the 3 photographs across the wooden planks of the picnic table. Maria wiped her forehead with a napkin and looked down. It took exactly 4 seconds for the older woman's face to drain of color. She looked from the motel receipt to the necklace gleaming on Alexandra's chest, and then, with devastating finality, she looked over at Jake. Jake was still sitting on the splintering bench at the edge of the pavilion. He was holding his aluminum can of cheap lager, his posture relaxed, his expression perfectly, chillingly blank. He met Maria's horrified gaze and offered nothing, no anger, no tears, no plea for sympathy. He just watched. Information in a blue-collar town does not spread through grand announcements. It moves like a virus through hushed whispers and sharp, sideways glances. Maria nudged the fry cook. The fry cook tapped the dishwasher. The photographs were passed down the table under the cover of paper plates and plastic cups. The ambient noise of the barbecue, the laughter, the clinking bottles, the loud complaints about the heat, began to systematically die out in pockets. Alexandra reached into the cooler for a bottle of water. When she turned back around, she felt it. The atmosphere in the pavilion had fundamentally shifted. The air felt heavier, thicker. She smiled at Maria, expecting the usual warm banter, but Maria immediately looked away, her mouth set in a tight, judgmental line. The line cook, who had just been joking with her, suddenly found his shoes incredibly interesting. Alexandra's smile faltered. She looked toward the main table. Brenda was standing completely still, the floral binder open in front of her, staring at Alexandra with a mixture of profound disgust and pity. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the humid summer air and flooded Alexandra's chest. Her hand flew instinctively to the white gold clasp at the back of her neck. It felt suddenly heavy, like a chain pulling her downward. She scanned the pavilion, watching the eyes of her community, the people who had commiserated with her poverty, who had praised her work ethic, who had believed her exhausted lies, turn entirely against her. Finally, her terrified gaze found Jake. He had not moved. He sat in the shadows of the pavilion's corrugated roof, insulated from the heat, simply watching the architecture of her double life collapse into dust. He raised his cheap beer a fraction of an inch, acknowledging her panic, before taking a slow, deliberate sip. In that agonizing stretch of silence, as the whispers of her colleagues grew loud enough to hear over the hissing grill, Alexandra realized the absolute terrifying truth. He had known everything, and he had brought her here to execute her in front of the whole world. The air beneath the wooden pavilion felt as though it had been sucked into a vacuum. The distant, lazy drone of a lawnmower and the loud sizzle of burger grease suddenly seemed miles away, entirely drowned out by the deafening roar of absolute social exile. Alexandra stood frozen by the plastic coolers, her hands still hovering defensively over the hollow of her throat. She looked at Maria, the older waitress who had brought over a homemade casserole when Jake's mother passed away 3 years ago. Maria's eyes were now flat, devoid of the maternal warmth she usually reserved for the younger diner staff. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She simply turned her back, scraping a half-eaten potato salad into an industrial trash can with a violent final scrape of her plastic fork. Brenda slammed the floral recipe binder shut. The sharp smack of the heavy cardboard covers echoed like a gunshot in the tense, humid air. She didn't march over to confront Alexandra. She didn't demand an explanation or hurl insults. In a community where people lived paycheck to paycheck, where covering each other's shifts, sharing tips, and collective suffering were the only true currency, Alexandra hadn't just broken a marriage, she had broken the fundamental code of their survival. She had played them all for fools, performing the exhausted, struggling wife, while wearing the expensive spoils of a wealthy man's bed. Alexandra started, the single syllable dry and brittle in her throat. She took a hesitant step toward the center picnic table. Brenda, please, let me explain. No one looked at her. The line cook, who had been laughing with her moments before, suddenly found a smudge on his sunglasses to obsessively clean. The dishwasher muttered something low to his wife, gripping her elbow and steering her deliberately toward the parking lot. It was a synchronized, devastating withdrawal. They were suffocating her not with loud, self-righteous outrage, but with total, instantaneous erasure. Alexandra's gaze swung frantically back to the edge of the pavilion, searching for Jake. He stood up slowly from the splintering bench. He tossed his empty aluminum can into a nearby recycling bin, a casual, mundane gesture that underscored the terrifying, surgical precision of his revenge. He didn't approach her to gloat. He didn't yell. He merely adjusted the collar of his faded flannel shirt, looked at her one last time with that same hollow, unreadable expression, and began walking toward the gravel path that led out of the park. He was leaving her there. He had brought her to the center of her universe, detonated the bomb in broad daylight, and was now walking away, completely untouched by the shrapnel. His heavy boots crunched rhythmically against the gravel, every step a final, undeniable statement. There would be no screaming matches in their cramped apartment tonight. There would be no desperate pleas for forgiveness. He had simply handed the truth to the jury and walked out of the courtroom. The pale yellow sundress, which only an hour ago had made her feel beautiful and elevated above the grease and grime of her daily life, now felt like a target painted directly on her skin. The white gold necklace burned against her collarbone like a brand, the illusion of her glamorous escape, of being special and deserving of Marcus's luxurious world, shattered into jagged, irreparable pieces. In this moment, under the harsh glare of the Scranton sun, she wasn't a tragic heroine seeking a better life. She was just a liar, standing entirely alone, stripped of her dignity, her husband, and the only world she truly belonged to. She couldn't breathe. The unspoken judgment in the air was a physical weight, pressing against her ribs until they ached. Turning her back on the pavilion, Alexandra broke into a desperate, stumbling run toward the overflow parking lot, the sound of her sandals slapping against the asphalt, echoing the frantic, terrified rhythm of a woman who had just realized she had absolutely nowhere left to hide. The drive from Naog Park to the affluent suburbs of Clark's Summit was a blur of frantic, suffocating heat. Alexandra gripped the steering wheel of her rusting sedan, her knuckles stark white, the transmission whining in protest as she forced the vehicle up the winding, tree-lined roads. Her phone sat on the passenger seat, the screen dark after 7 consecutive unanswered calls to Marcus. She needed him to tell her it would be okay. She needed him to validate the catastrophic implosion of her life, to offer the luxurious sanctuary he had always promised, with his soft hands and expensive gifts. She pulled into the expansive, manicured parking lot of the regional country club, where Marcus often spent his Saturday afternoons. The contrast between her dented car and the rows of gleaming imported SUVs was violently apparent. She sat in the stifling heat of her cabin for 10 agonizing minutes before the glass doors of the clubhouse opened. Marcus stepped out, flanked by 2 men in crisp golf polos. He was laughing, tossing a set of keys in his hand. He looked exactly as he always did, untouched, comfortable, insulated by wealth and privilege. Alexandra threw her car door open and stumbled onto the pristine asphalt. The pale yellow sundress was wilted, clinging to her damp skin. "Marcus," she called out, her voice cracking, completely devoid of the effortless charm she usually employed around him. Marcus stopped. The smile vanished from his face instantly, replaced by a rigid, terrifying blankness. He muttered something low to his companions, who nodded and walked toward their respective vehicles, casting curious, lingering glances at the disheveled woman standing in the blazing sun. Marcus closed the distance between them, his strides quick and aggressive. When he reached her, he did not reach out to touch her face. He did not pull her into the cool, sandalwood-scented sanctuary of his embrace. He grabbed her elbow, his grip tight enough to bruise, and shoved her roughly out of the line of sight of the clubhouse windows, forcing her behind the heavy shadow of a large decorative oak tree. "Are you out of your mind?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a vicious, venomous whisper. "What the hell are you doing here, Alex?" "Jake knows," she choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracing hot, pathetic lines through her makeup. "He knew everything. He printed out the motel receipts, the restaurant bills. He planted them at the diner barbecue. Everyone saw, Marcus. Everyone. I have nowhere to go." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with desperate expectation, waiting for the lifeboat to deploy. Marcus stared at her. His perfectly groomed eyebrows drew together, not in sympathy, but in cold, calculated arithmetic. He released her elbow as if she had suddenly caught fire. He took a distinct, deliberate step backward, putting a physical boundary between his pristine world and her radioactive ruin. "He printed my receipts?" Marcus asked, his tone shifting from angry to dangerously clinical. "Did my name show up? Did my face?" Alexandra blinked, the question failing to compute in her panicked mind. "What? No, it was just the room number and the visa. Marcus, please, you have to help me. I lost my marriage. I can't even go back to work. I lost everything for you." "You didn't lose anything for me," he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the honeyed affection that had coaxed her into room 114. "You made a choice because you were bored. And now you've gotten sloppy." Alexandra gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, as if he had struck her across the face. "I have a wife, Alex," Marcus continued, adjusting the collar of his shirt, restoring his armor. "I have a reputation in this town, a business to run. I am not throwing a grenade into my life just because you couldn't keep your husband distracted. Do not call my phone again. Do not ever show up here." He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked away, the leather soles of his expensive shoes clicking rhythmically against the asphalt. A minute later, his silver sedan pulled out of the lot, gliding smoothly past her, without the brake lights even flickering. Alexandra stood alone in the deep shadow of the oak tree. Her trembling hand reached up, her fingers closing around the white gold necklace he had given her just days ago. In the oppressive afternoon heat, she finally felt the absolute crushing weight of the metal. It wasn't a promise of a better life. It was just a heavy, cheap chain, and she had placed it around her own neck. The apartment was suffocatingly still by the time the deadbolt finally turned. The sun had set hours ago, casting long, bruised shadows across the scuffed linoleum of the kitchen. Jake sat at the chipped formica table in the dark. He hadn't bothered to turn on the overhead fluorescent light. In front of him sat a single, faded canvas duffel bag, zipped and waiting. The door opened slowly, the hinges whining in the heavy silence. Alexandra stepped inside. The pale yellow sundress, which had looked so radiant in the afternoon sun, was now stained with sweat and wrinkled beyond recognition. The white gold necklace was gone, leaving a faint, angry red scratch against her collarbone where she had frantically unclasped it. She looked entirely hollowed out, her makeup smeared beneath eyes that were bloodshot, exhausted, and terrified. She stood in the threshold, staring at the duffel bag on the table, and then up at Jake's face in the gloom. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the familiar, pathetic rattle of the aging refrigerator. "He didn't want you," Jake said. It was not a question. His voice was perfectly level, devoid of malice or triumph, carrying only the crushing weight of an indisputable fact. Alexandra flinched, a ragged sob catching in her dry throat. She slumped against the closed door, sliding down the cheap veneer until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled tight to her chest. "Jake, please," she whispered, the sound cracking in the quiet room. I was so tired. I was so tired of this place, of counting pennies, of the late notices, of never, ever having enough." Jake looked at her, his expression remaining entirely neutral. He didn't cross the room to comfort her, nor did he stand up to scream or throw the unpaid bills in her face. He simply observed her, much like he had done for the past few agonizing weeks. "We were both tired, Alex. Jake replied softly. That's what this life is. But I came home to this apartment every single morning because you were here. I kicked wooden pallets for 12 hours a night so we could keep the lights on in this kitchen. I thought we were drowning, but I thought we were doing it together. I'm sorry, she gasped, burying her face in her trembling hands. It was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake. He meant nothing to me. It was just an escape. Don't do that, Jake said, his voice dropping a fraction, a terrifying hint of steel finally cutting through his calm facade. Don't insult my intelligence, and don't lie to yourself. It wasn't a mistake. You didn't slip and fall into a motel room on Route 81. You packed an unworn apron. You lied about your shifts to my face. You washed off his cologne with our hot water, and you sat at this exact table, eating the food I cooked, while wearing jewelry he bought you. Those were choices, Alex. Hundreds of quiet, calculated choices. Alexandra wept, the sound wet and pathetic in the dark apartment. She had no defense left. The narrative she had desperately spun to justify her actions, the tragic, neglected wife seeking solace from a broken man, had been entirely dismantled, leaving only the ugly, undeniable truth of her own profound selfishness. You thought I was too broken down by this town to notice, Jake continued, standing up slowly from the chair. He picked up his car keys from the table, the metal jingling sharply in the quiet room. You thought you could keep your safe, reliable husband paying the rent while you played pretend in a silver sedan, but Marcus doesn't want a waitress from Scranton with a ruined reputation. And I don't want a wife who looks at me and sees a blind fool. He picked up the duffel bag by its frayed canvas straps, slinging it over his shoulder. He walked toward the door, his heavy steel-toed boots making a slow, deliberate sound against the worn floorboards, leaving her alone in the dark. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, the sound echoing through the cramped apartment with the finality of a gavel. Alexandra remained seated on the scuffed linoleum, her back pressed against the peeling veneer of the door. She listened to the rhythmic, heavy thud of Jake's steel-toed boots descending the external stairwell. Each step was a metronome counting down the remaining seconds of her old life. When the sound finally faded into the ambient noise of the Scranton night, the silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. She slowly pulled herself up, her legs trembling under the weight of her exhaustion. The kitchen looked exactly as it always had, yet entirely foreign. The tin pot of macaroni and hot dogs sat congealed on the cold stovetop. The stack of past-due bills rested on the chipped formica table, right where Jake's duffel bag had been. She had spent months resenting this room, viewing it as a cage built of poverty and missed opportunities. Now, she realized it hadn't been a cage at all. It had been a sanctuary, and she had methodically dismantled it from the inside out. Tomorrow, the sun would rise over Naog Park. Her shift at Lou's Diner would technically begin at 6 in the morning, but she knew she could never walk through those glass double doors again. Brenda, Maria, Lou, they would look right through her. Or worse, they would look at her with the same chilling disgust Marcus had shown. She was a ghost in her own hometown, anchored by a white gold chain she had already thrown onto the bedroom floor, worthless and heavy. Down in the dimly lit parking lot, Jake unlocked the door of his 1998 Honda Accord. He tossed the faded canvas duffel bag onto the passenger seat, the zipper clinking against the plastic console. He slid behind the wheel, the cold vinyl biting through his flannel shirt. He turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and finally caught, vibrating with its familiar, pathetic rattle. He pulled out of the complex, merging onto the desolate stretch of State Street. The streetlights overhead cast rhythmic, amber shadows across his face, highlighting the dark circles beneath his eyes. He had done it. He had executed the perfect retaliation. He had exposed Alexandra to the community she desperately needed to impress, and he had done it without raising his voice or shedding a single tear in public. The architecture of her lies had been entirely burned to the ground, but as he drove past the glowing fluorescent signs of the all-night gas stations and the dark sleeping houses of his blue-collar neighborhood, the taste of victory in his mouth turned to ash. There was no triumphant swell of music. There was no sudden, profound sense of liberation. His chest simply felt hollowed out, excavated by the weeks of silent endurance and the ugly, calculated effort it took to destroy the woman he had promised to love. Revenge, Jake realized, was not a bridge to a better place. It was merely a match struck in a dark, empty room, It illuminated the wreckage for a brief, blinding moment, only to leave you sitting entirely alone in the cold once the flame burned out. He reached the on-ramp for Route 81, the headlights cutting through the bruised purple darkness of the late night. A few miles down the highway, the flickering, broken neon sign of the Starlight Motel approached on the right. Jake kept his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't slow down. He didn't turn his head to look at the overflowing dumpsters or the dark green door of room 114. He simply let the motel vanish in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. The heater in the Honda was still broken, and the air rushing through the drafty windows was bitterly cold, but as the miles stretched out ahead of him, the passenger seat was finally, irrevocably empty.